Okay, he's here.
Cool.
Okay. Starting the panel.
The guys claim that you are first on the agenda. I missed you guys too. Yeah, I had another meeting appointment. Was it interesting? There's no possibility to discuss something anyway in such a large group. Yeah. Okay. Okay. William, do I have your slides for the device flow? I don't. Oh, okay. Oh, got it. Okay, William, do you want to come over here? Do you need the clicker? Do you need the clicker or? Try it. Does it work? Yep. Good. Thanks.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Friday morning. Here to talk. Here to give a bit of an update about the device flow draft. So just a quick word on the status. We've actually already cleared working group last call, I believe. There have been a couple of changes proposed, so I'll go over those changes. But hopefully we can get this thing done pretty soon. So a bit of a recap first. What is the device flow? The device flow is authorization flow designed for devices that have an internet connection, but maybe they don't have a browser or they only have a very limited input mechanism. In that case, the user will be reviewing the authorization request on a secondary device, like a laptop or a smartphone. So how it works is something like this. The TV app, as an example, the TV app will display a URL that the user will need to visit on their secondary device and a code that they'll need to enter. The user then visits that URL on their second device, enters the code, and from that point, it looks a little bit like regular Oauth from a consent point of view. During that, the device continues to poll one of the endpoints, the token endpoint, with the device code to see if the user has completed their action, and if they have completed their action, they'll get back the refresh token and access token. So it's kind of like the authorization service sort of issued like an authorization code that's not actually yet valid, and at some point in the future, it may become valid or it may become invalid. That's kind of how it works. All right, so on to the important stuff. What changed since 98? The first thing is we had a fairly lively debate, I don't know if you recall, in Chicago on the user code param. So this was a proposal by James Manager from Telstra, and the idea was, what if we could include the user code in the verification URL? So if you're not familiar with the draft, the authorization server responds with a number of different fields, and the the verification URL is a separate field to user code. And the intent is that these things are separately consumable. But what if you want to do something like this, right? So what if you want to have a QR code or any kind of like non-textual transmission of that URL? Depending on kind of where you are, like I think in America people don't all really know what QR codes are, so we don't actually see this a lot. But it's kind of a good example. You could replace that with a Bluetooth thing or whatever you want, any way of transmitting a URL. So what we talked about, this was kind of, it generated a lot of debate, particularly because I said that actually my own company's server won't be using this. So people are like, well, why are you putting it in there? The consensus call was that it is worth doing. So in the 06 update, we did actually document that with some appropriate security considerations. This is an optional enhancement, so it's fairly well interoperable because the authorization server will still display all the information, and we're actually requiring that the client still actually display the two pieces of that information separately. So if the user doesn't know how to process that thing, whatever that may be, they can still sort of fall back into it manually. And if the authorization server actually doesn't support that, and the user happens to scan it, they're just going to end up at that URL and they have to type in the code anyway. So it's kind of like the client, it's completely interoperable in the sense that the client doesn't have to actually rely on the server supporting it. It can just sort of try it as a best effort, and everything will kind of still work. This is kind of one of the nice things about this flow is that it's sort of fairly durable. What we see a lot of people doing is they might try some more advanced method of pairing, say, the TV to the phone. Maybe they have their own app installed. So, you might, and this is like out of this spec, but you might like open up that app and do something, and then kind of fall back to this standard flow. So Justin, who I think is joining us at 3:30 in the morning. Apologies. He's online 3:30 in the morning. He posed, there's a couple of open questions on the list that I'd like to go through. And just remember that the draft is sort of beyond working group last call, but so this is the last chance to finalize some of these normative things. So the first thing he suggested was instead of specifying the user code parameter in that URL construction that I mentioned, what if the authorization server returned a separate parameter? So just to be clear, currently the authorization server is returning two fields, a verification URI and a user code, and we have normative text to say that you can join them together using a URL parameter. Justin proposed an alternative, which is have three parameters related to this, where there'd be like a third kind of optimized URL. So I don't know if Justin, if you're awake, did you have any comments that you'd like to make at this time on that, since it was your idea?
Oh, he's let's him. Wow. Hey, Justin, go ahead.
We can see you.
All right. Morning, everybody. So the basic thought here, William, if you could actually go back to your high definition TV graphic there, thank you. So this picture is actually impossible with the current spec. Because what you would actually get is example.com/device : user code equals WDG blah, 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 what's etc. And yeah, that. Thank you. You would get that on the top line, that URL, and if you go back to the other thing, you would get the plain code on the next line, and then that QR code. So this picture, you can't actually get this picture with the current spec.
Oh, I think you can actually. So
unless I'm missing something, which is entirely possible.
Right. Perhaps you are, because the device authorization endpoint is returning https://example.com/device, that part, as the verification URI. And then it's returning a separate JSON parameter called user code with that value. Okay. And then the spec is basically saying, as an optimization, if you wish, and and you want to display that verification URI sort of textually, then you can use a parameter, standard URL parameter that happens to match the key of the JSON called user code, and pass in the URL. So it basically tells you how to construct this optimized URL.
Okay. So that's constructed client side then.
Correct. Yes.
All right. That was unclear to me. Even in reading the new paragraph in 6. So let me reread that again, and I may have some wording changes. So see, I thought that this constructed URL was coming from the server, so that's my mistake. But because I garden pathed on that, I'll read through what is that, section 331 again, and see if we can armor that a little bit better so that somebody else doesn't do what I thought that you were suggesting that we're doing. So
that's good feedback. Great.
Okay, fantastic. So I withdraw my my proposal. I think whatever it was. It's 3 in the morning. Whatever the word is.
Thank you for joining this call. I'm impressed to see you there.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Want to make the same suggestion that Justin was originally making for a slightly different reason, and that is, as it stands with just the 2 parameters, you are then requiring the client to do this construction of the complete URL. You're requiring that the user code parameter then be standardized so that the client knows what that is. That's putting a bunch of work on the client, which historically doesn't always go so well. Additionally, it's limiting flexibility on the part of the server, because now the endpoint that receives the user code via query string and the endpoint that the customer would type that user code into have to be the same, which may or may not work out. They may want to use a different URL for the parameterized endpoint, perhaps one that is going to be captured by their mobile app if it is on the device, whereas the simple to enter shortened form of the URL may not be.
That's a good point.
Oh, I forgot something important. I forgot meeting minute taker. Oops. No, Mike, can you take a few notes? Is that possible? Because you're not presenting today, or you have no laptop with you. Okay. You want to sit next to me? I guess that's the only table here.
And that was from Annabelle Backman from Amazon, Mike, for your benefit.
Yeah. Well, and for the Jabber, can someone take a look at the Jabber room to see whether Justin or Hans or Phil posed some questions?
It's Friday.
Yeah. So if someone could open the Jabber and have a look at it, that would be great. You don't even have a Jabber plan. Brian, do you have Jabber open? Okay. Okay, thanks. Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
so what is the conclusion?
Okay, well, firstly, to discuss your point, yeah, I think it's a good point. I guess you could have potentially 2 different targets for that. A couple of other things I thought about in trying to come up with an opinion on this was also, I guess you can have a higher entropy code for that magical one, so that could be beneficial in some way. Yeah, I guess on the well, the other thing is that you would actually know that the authorization service supports that. Yes. Yeah. On the flip side, I guess it's it's one extra piece of information coming down. Yeah, I don't know. I guess both are slightly complex, like you said. In this case, I think the construction of the URL is very simple. So as much as I would normally agree, like, let's get everything away from the client as possible, I would really hope people couldn't make a mistake with this, but maybe they would.
URL parameter encoding is hard. I mean, it's not, but it's harder than we think it is.
Yeah. That's a good point. That probably should be added if we keep the current text. So for people that didn't quite catch that, Dick asked, is there a requirement that the existing user code be URL safe? And I'm not entirely sure. We may specify an alphabet for it. We may specify a character range for it.
I believe there's a character range specified.
Right, which I think is probably URL safe.
Yeah, I was going to say, if it's not required, it's certainly highly suggested by the characters suggested to be easily entered and remembered by the user.
Right. We wouldn't want the authorization server to attack the client, though, with some kind of weird malformed URL.
Something in my experience I've seen with clients implementing Oauth 2-based services is they frequently aren't reading these specs. So, yeah, I know, right? Yeah. So banking on clients having an understanding of what is in the spec and isn't, and what the actual, what's reasonable to expect around the values of these parameters isn't necessarily a safe assumption as far as hoping that's going to make things easier for them.
Right.
Just let me know when I'm actually. You guys hear me?
Yep.
Oh,
I can
okay,
hear.
thanks. Thank you, Leif. To Brian's comment about the character set suggesting things that are easy to type, I want us to keep in mind that that presumes a US style ASCII keyboard is as far as things that are quote easy to type. There are lots of keyboards around the world that put lots of non-URL safe characters well within reach, and it might make sense in other contexts to have things that are very easy to recognize and type that would still need to be URL encoded. So Annabelle's point about URL encoding, I think, does have merit.
Annabelle, for the purposes of the minutes, repeat for me from the microphone the suggestion that you were making, because I
Sure.
didn't capture it.
Yeah, so Annabelle Backman, Amazon, kind of reiterating Justin's suggestion that we have a separate parameter that contains the, I guess, clickable URL that has the code embedded in it. So there's two experiences we're talking about here. One, which is the primary one that Williams presented, that is the customer user types in a URL and then types in a code. The alternative is the automated experience where they engage with a QR code or through some other mechanism, a URL is opened that already has the code embedded in that. Have a separate parameter for that URL so that the client does not have to try and construct it. That reduces the amount that we have to standardize on these endpoints, because then we no longer have to standardize a query string parameter for the user code. And it opens up flexibility for the server to use a different endpoint for that, express the code in some other means, or have a higher entropy code. It just decouples that from the streamlined for user entry experience.
This is Dave Robin. I would not wanting to repeat everything she just said because I think it's great, but one other possible wrinkle here or use case is that in this case where you're presenting the typable URL and the typable code, you're sending the user to a very UI UX HTML based server guy that's serving up human pages. He may in fact be turning around and sending it with a garbagey code to the backend server who's actually completing the operation. So there's some opportunity here to just send them straight to the garbagey guy. The skipping the whole UI server, the one that's got pages and stuff to interact with humans. And so with this option with the QR code, they could scan that, go straight to the final representation guy with the right code and just skip a step, skip a server.
Dave, what was your last name again?
Robin,
Robin.
one being the last.
Just waiting for him to finish typing. So, that's Sakimura no research. I support Annabelle's idea. In one of the implementation we have, not entirely all, we actually do send URI, which is a good idea, as well as we kind of send QR code image itself,
Okay.
because the terminal could be really dumb.
Right.
The other thing is that I was just scanning user code in the text, and I don't quite see the exact constraint on the user code. So,
Okay. Actually,
and
what?
also to that point, to somebody's point, it might be, if it's a user code, it might be also a good idea to, not to constrain too much.
Right.
In the sense that, for example, if you're using Japanese phone, right, smartphone, it's actually much easier to type Japanese character than alphabet.
So I have a question for you, if you could stay there for 1 second. So do you think that would actually make the most sense from a user point of view in Japan to have a hiragana code or?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's much easier. actually.
Okay. So we should document it as Unicode.
But then that means that, but
No,
that,
takes
that,
time.
that means that's just possible. But that means that composability of URI is also strong.
Descartes, Amazon. We recently looked at stuff that people could type in across the world and concluded the digits work really well.
Okay.
Right. And that anything that's a char set, it's confusing with different
Right.
keyboards and all kinds of other locales. And so potentially just having it be just pure digits, because you only got 20 bits now, so you only lose half the res, and
Right.
everybody knows what a number is.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of why we landed on the characters to double the.
Right, but are you buying? I mean, all you need is one more
Right.
character one more thing.
Out of curiosity, like how many numbers do you typically use in such a? I don't know if you're referring to this exact type of flow, but
No, not that exact type of flow, but as we're choosing things, we realize that numbers are much easier for a number of different types of input mechanisms.
right,
Particularly when you move to voice.
right. Good point.
So that's Sakimura and Nara again. Yeah, I fully support if we are just going to number. That's it. Even easier.
Okay. I'd probably rather not do that because it'll bring our running code out of compliance. but I think it's an extremely good point. Yeah, I would. I mean, yeah. Right.
Yeah. So
So the other dangerous things with characters is you can accidentally create words, which did actually happen to us. So we dropped all the vowels.
So that's Sakimura again. If you really want high entropy stuff, it's actually kind of good to send down the QR code image itself. You can clam a lot of characters in it.
Right. So
The QR code with the
Like
as the complete URI, right?
like a URI to an image, which you download and is the code. Yeah. So I guess the only drawback with that is that it assumes that it's a QR code. So this in my example was the example. I guess I could see like NFC being another way to represent that URL potentially. Or you mean like adding another parameter?
Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about optimizing user experience, right?
Right.
Yeah, so if it's targeting the QR code, then send the QR code directly. If we are targeting NFC, maybe it's a good idea to optimize towards NFC.
Okay. Actually, I have another localized usability question for you, if you have a second. So do you see like this actually being successful with QR codes as per this example in Japan?
Yeah, well, right, and bunch of ATMs are actually using that. Even not even within Japan, but for example in Singapore, or I guess the same in Australia as well. So, people doesn't have to carry around the magstripe core,
Right.
but just use their phone.
And you think that parameter, should that be additional to the additional parameter, or should that be instead of?
That's a good question.
Okay.
That's a good, yeah, that's a good question. But yeah, if it's going to be image, I guess it will have to be. Right?
Separate.
Yeah.
Okay.
But then, well, you also have to think about, I'm not very familiar with the NFC kind of things, but if you think about sending something for the consumption of an NFC device, and how to do that,
Right.
you may need another one. So you might want to have
if the John Bradley Yubico, if the device supports NFC, just sending a URI over NFC is actually pretty well understood. That's
Okay.
not.
Yeah.
I don't know that you need to send a separate, unless you're doing something super complicated. Just sending the. If we had a separate URI, having the device send that over NFC, you ought not to need another parameter unless we're doing something horribly wrong. So the only question is whether or not devices have a library to create the QR code locally or not.
And
Or make a call.
Yeah, I mean,
that's
in
true.
many
There-
cases it doesn't.
That's true. There could be a remote QR code generator. Yeah. So I guess like as currently written, even with disregarding the decision between the composability or not, the kind of point was like, here's this URL that you can use, transmit it however you want to transmit URLs. And so I did like the simplicity of that. And
Yeah, to that point, I think if we try and get into tailoring the spec to particular transmission technologies, we're going to go down a huge rat hole of never ending. Do we want to support this? Do we want to support that?
Yeah.
If we limit the spec to getting the code from the server to the device and give it with enough flexibility that the device can then get it to a secondary device through whatever transport makes sense, then I think we're solving the right problem.
right. Yep.
A couple things, Descartes, again. It's not clear to me where we're really working on interop, right, as opposed to this just being a best practice. So as I looked over the doc, there wasn't really anything that says like when are they two different parties as opposed to all the same party? If it's all the same party, then do whatever they want.
Right.
Which means that maybe this is more of a good guideline around how to do it well, so people don't do stupid stuff. But it might be easier to sort of call it the use case where it really is requiring they are two independent people, right? Which, OAuth is, there is two different entities that are trying to
Yeah.
get the flow.
Yeah. So I mean, Justin and I actually did do an interop test. His server, my client, written completely independently. It doesn't.
I mean, like a real
Yeah.
real world
Yeah.
instance where the device and the server are from two different players.
Yeah.
Does that happen?
I'm not aware of an example that comes to mind. I guess that doesn't mean that there isn't one.
Okay. So we are, but
Okay.
and I'm not sure that it would necessarily work, that we would necessarily want to do this. Because the model here is a very browser web oriented model where the world's moving more and more to a mobile app model, right?
Right.
So the customers aren't going to go and pull out their laptop necessarily, they're going to pull out their phone.
Absolutely.
They're pulling out their phone, then you're really trying to bind the device to potentially an app running on the phone, and that the user's already authenticated into that app, right? As opposed to making the user authenticate into something in the cloud that they don't really have the credentials or anything for. And so I could see the QR code helping where you really scan it with a QR code, which essentially eventually launches the app on the phone. And so the user's already authenticated, and,
Right.
and then really the only UX is an approval process by the user.
Right. And in that case, like you're saying, you don't actually need the interop. You control both sides.
No, you don't.
Oh, not always. Okay.
Right. So
Yeah.
in the Alexa world, right, there's many third parties that are putting out devices where you want to enable that third party to make calls into Alexa.
Okay.
And so we do require some interop there, although we could just say what to do because
Right.
it's our world.
Yeah.
But it would be nicer if it was standardized and was more of a practice. But we would probably want more of a flow like that
Right.
that I described than a flow that's very web oriented.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Also, I presume you may need a fallback in case the user doesn't have the app installed, or is using a device not supported by your app.
It's pretty hard to turn a device up.
Okay, it's actually a requirement.
Yeah.
I guess
It's not a requirement, it's just hard.
Right.
Because
there definitely exists use cases I'm aware of where you may want like an optimized flow, but then you still want the fallback of the browser.
yeah, so you still want the fallback.
yeah.
But you want the 80% case to work super quickly.
Right. Right. And actually, one of the cool things you can do with this construction here is that you can actually use this as a visual pairing confirmation code too. So the fact that the data's already there, a bit like the Bluetooth kind of pairing, like, is your TV.
The thing I loaded, I scanned something, but is it really the
thing?
that particular device?
Yeah, particularly helpful when you're working on the team and there's like 100 of those devices in proximity. But also relevant for apartments and hotels.
John Bradley Ubico. So I'm influenced by the arguments that having a separate pre-composed URI that could have a different endpoint and perhaps different amount of entropy than the user typeable one is probably a good idea, given that a lot of this will be either NFC or QR codes to an app, which is, I think, a growing, or even audio to an app. I mean, there's a number of different ways. I don't know that we should add the QR code directly. We may want to leave that as an extension so that apps could have an introspection endpoint that gets a QR code from the URI, etc. So I think that trying to generically add QR codes or sound files, etc., should probably be left as an extension. But I guess the other thing is that doesn't Google already do this sort of thing with printers? And there are, Google doesn't yet make printers, but there are printers that use
we have
device
printers
flows.
using this. Absolutely.
Right. So that is the case of a third-party client.
Okay. Is that what you meant? Okay. Yep. Yeah, YouTube's biggest customer is actually YouTube's app, but yeah.
Right.
Okay, that's a good point. The printer one is a good example. I guess I thought you were meaning like, would that printer, potentially be doing this exact flow to another authorization server as well?
Well, what we have to do is care about the interop where the device manufacturer, i.e. Epson, isn't, or do they even still make printers? I don't know. They're not providing the Oauth server. It's some either personal or some print service, which is offered by Microsoft or Google or whoever.
Right.
So we have to think about some of the interop things. I can also buy making the code numeric for reasons, at least as a recommendation.
All right, so I guess I feel like there's sort of two changes that we're proposing here. One is to move to a separate URI as the kind of optimized one, and allowing any character in the user code, but suggesting numbers. Is that what I'm hearing? Strongly suggesting numbers. Well, that we may not care about anymore.
If you're saying they could kind of make up anything, you still want them to go and make it URL safe.
Right, but only with this proposal, I guess. If we move to the separate URI, then I guess that doesn't matter anymore. Is that?
You're wanting the client to construct
away.
Move away from the client constructing.
So if it's separate, then all you're doing is displaying some UTF-8 characters for some individual
Right.
web.
So the client would no longer be constructing the URI.
If we combine the two proposals,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I just worry that clients doing stupid stuff of URL encoding something extra and then it breaking. So,
Right. So
like if you're handing them down a URL, you'd want it to be a,
I think if we make it Unicode, then I definitely agree. Let's just send a separate URI, if that makes sense. So, I don't know. Do you want to do a vote on that, or any need, or no voting? Oh, that's true. Do we need a consensus call on any of these items?
No, that
Okay, we have passed
I
working
think
group
that
last call,
sounds
so we
fairly,
need to
yeah,
not.
I think that also sounds like fairly reasonable. I don't think we need to,
Okay.
like having a URL saved and making recommendation to use numbers, like,
Okay.
who wouldn't?
All right, so I think we'll
Say
just
that
capture that
that's
as
a good idea.
the decision then, unless anyone objects.
So Mike Jones. I guess, and I'll admit, I don't understand this well enough to make a really informed comment, but introducing a second endpoint that's distinct from the one that's already in the spec seems like a pretty big change to do at this stage in the game. Yeah, okay, that's the language people have been using, is having a separate URL and a separate endpoint. So what am I confused about?
I was going to go up and say the same. I mean, it sounds, not to get into the details, but it sounds like a bigger change than a working group last call change, and you might want to respin another couple of weeks working group last call.
So, Mike, I believe the suggestion is to add a new parameter which has a pre-composed version of the URI, which enables the user code to have higher entropy and be pre-URL encoded, which gets around the problem. We also need to think about the user displayable user code. If we are actually using UTF-8, what is the script? There's other issues that tend to send specs into a tailspin once you actually attempt to internationalize them in that way. Not that I'm saying it's bad, but just sending UTF-8 characters doesn't actually work for everyone. But certainly whatever we do with making the displayed user code internationalized, that immediately leads one to having a separate pre-composed URI. And I believe Annabelle made the suggestion that if you had a separate URI that you were sending pre-composed URI, it could actually have a different path. But that would be an implementation detail. We're not saying that you need a different endpoint, but as an implementation detail, if the AS wanted to do an optimization, nothing forces it to have exactly the same path.
I guess we will have to look at the text to see how this ends up.
A quick comment on the UTF-8 concern, because I think I'd like not to walk away here and have that whole thing blow up. So I guess we're not going to require that clients can display any character that gets sent at them. The authorization server would have to use its best judgment for the market. Is it?
Well, but the client needs to know.
So the client needs to know in some way what the script it's supposed to display the UTF-8 characters in. That the server on its own,
Okay.
if these are actually interoperable separate devices, if you had a Korean printer that knew that it was going to use Korean script, but as soon as that's shipped to South America, that's not going to work so well. So somehow, if we are actually allowing internationalized characters as opposed to numbers, the script needs. It's not my fault. I wasn't. Yeah.
I think Dick's idea is looking better and better by the minute.
I just suggested that the UTF-8 might be Japanese character would be easier to type the alphabet
Right.
in Japanese smartphone keyboard. But I was just asking for something, some kind of thing which is reasonable for people to type in, and numbers just miss it.
Okay, so let me see if I get this right. We're going to keep it the same. It's numbers and A to Z, please, so we don't break my interop. Well, wait a minute. If we're sending, if us sending characters shouldn't be harmful to your interop.
Microsoft would agree. We're using letters.
So let's keep it as is and add in internationalized like usability considerations and suggest numbers as that to solve that problem.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon, just to completely bury the UTF-8 discussion.
Thank you.
Keep in mind that the more complicated the display requirements for the client, the more devices and use cases we exclude from being able to use this. The whole point of device code is that it is usable in scenarios where the device has constrained input and output. So if you're
Agree.
if you're trying to output everything in Unicode, that's going to be really hard on a really low res LCD display.
I agree. I'm
Right.
I'm sad that we won't be able to have a emoji based user code now, but that was for a few brief minutes that looked possible.
And quickly to further address Mike's comment, and John was right that I think we're not talking about necessarily defining a separate endpoint. We're just talking about defining a separate parameter with a URL that may or may not point to a different endpoint. And bear in mind that the spec itself says nothing about what those endpoints do. It's very deliberately leaves that up to the AS, just as OAuth leaves the process of resource owner identification and authorization and all of that up to the implementers. This spec leaves everything that happens at these endpoints up to the implementers.
All right, Leif Johansson. So we went from here's a URL, type this in, and type in these characters to multiple, at least two ways you can get hopefully to the same place. Has anybody done security analysis on this? Are there any security aspects involved in two ways that are supposed to take you to the same place?
We could talk to the security research and let them include that in their formal analysis. They like to do that.
I have no idea. I mean, I guess part of the discussion we had at the last IETF was that there are, when you present that the first generation of this user interface, here's an input box, type this, right? That's like maybe harder to confuse or confuse users over or get wrong. I have no idea, but again, this seems like something shouldn't just crank this out in a last call comment. This needs somebody to look at it and re-review or something.
It sounds like this change will need another last call.
Well,
if we accept the change.
Yeah, we have to look at the text, and I think we definitely have to discuss it confirm it on a mailing list. So whether it would be big enough in the end to have another working group last call, I don't know, but it shouldn't be a big deal anyway. And then there was not a joke with the security researchers. Like we had this meeting, and they offered help with some of those activities, so we could
I mean, definitely one of the things I liked about the old way is that it sort of falls back very nicely. If the server didn't understand the URL, it just displays the original URL anyway. But I guess it shouldn't be sending something it doesn't understand in the revised proposal anyway. So,
Dave Robin,
What do you mean by the old way?
I don't know what I think the method documented in 06 being the old way.
I'm curious to make sure we understand where we're ending up and where we're going with this, because I think I heard two different things. One is that if we make the code URL safe, then composition by the client is no problem. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to say a lot of things about it. But Also, then we have this idea of providing you the complete URL, which requires no composition. So the question is, implementations aside,
Yeah.
are we deprecating what you show on the screen right now? In other words, the code is only for typing into web pages, and the composed URL is only for, you know, sending it as a parameter. Having what you have on the screen now of user code equals that, which is composed by the client somehow based on these two pieces, the first pieces 1 and 2 to make this URL, is that option still on the table? Other than the fact that implementations are doing it today, perhaps. But if we have option 3, if we have parameter 3, I might make the case that client composition should never be done, and this server parameter of user code equals should never be allowed, that it's opaque, because, you know, that user code equals URL parameter is just not a thing.
Yeah.
It's either opaque in case 3, parameter 3, or it's never used in 1 and 2. You go to 1, you type 2.
Yep. I do agree. So we should document one or the other, not both. Absolutely.
Okay.
And maybe, yeah.
Okay, I thought we were ending up with both.
Absolutely. Let's not do both. Let's pick one.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. To the security considerations point, there is text in version 06 of the draft that brings up remote phishing concerns around the composed URL. So the current draft does actually address or at least raise the risk of, you know, increased ability to trick the user when you're not forcing them to type in a code that they see on a screen. So I would encourage anyone who's interested or concerned about that risk to review the spec and take a look at that language and see if you have any concerns beyond what's addressed there. No, it's more guidance for the authorization server around making sure that the experience they present through that composed URL still gives the end user the ability to detect that phishing might be going on. Yeah. It kind of raises the bar necessary for that experience, basically.
Yeah. And a comment on phishing, I guess, like one of the things that we were trying to establish is basically, are you setting up a device, and is that device currently in your possession? That was sort of the challenge that we're trying to answer. And so when we were thinking about like what UI to show, we were even thinking of asking that question, like, is the device in front of you and is it displaying this code, you know, to try and mitigate that. I think that might be in the draft.
Lucy Lynch, just a process thing. Hannes, I think these are enough changes that it's breaking for last call, and that you would have to go to last call again.
Sounds fine. Thank you. All right, we do. There is another open question. So, right, let me quickly go over this. So, yeah, we added some ASCII diagrams. That's all good. Justin pointed out that after discussion on the list, that while it's a polling protocol, there is no actual requirement that you have to poll at it. There's no requirement that you poll at that interval. You can poll at a slower interval. You can wait for user interaction to initiate a poll that would look more like a single request. Okay, so there is another last minute topic that was sort of proposed after working group last call. This was an interesting one because there were kind of 3 people that kind of came up with it all at the same time. Well, not at the same time, but and that is this question.
At least for the minutes in the working group, what is motivating people to want to make these changes now? I really don't understand what these are for. Why isn't what we have fine?
I guess I don't really know what their motives are, but I'm assuming that it was the working group last call that triggered some last minute reviews. It's
perfectly fine to provide these comments at this stage, even at the IETF last call. So I don't think it's.
I'm not questioning process. I'm asking from an engineering perspective, why do people want to do it differently than it's already specified? I don't understand that.
I don't think they want to do it differently. My sense is more like people, and I've seen this in other environments, since we are further along in the process, people look at this and found out that they can actually use this document to cover some of their use cases, specifically some of the IoT use cases. And I've actually experienced that myself in the healthcare space. Some people looked at this and said, this is what I want.
Yeah, Descartes, Amazon. I mean, we started looking at this and started looking at where we're going, and then we saw some of the issues, particularly of characters versus digits.
Okay, so the other kind of major change that was proposed is related to this fact that you may have multiple devices that are actually all the same. So take, for example, a Roku device. If you have, say, 2 TVs, you may have 2 Rokus, both authorizing to YouTube or whoever, and both would actually have the same client ID. And so there is a proposal around, okay, so if they both have the same client ID and the user, say, loses upgrades or sells or it's stolen or something, if one of those devices is gone, how do they revoke just that one device? As written, the spec doesn't really provide any help to the authorization server to provide a good revoke experience. I guess you could look at when the token was last used, but that probably doesn't help a whole lot if someone bought it off you and is continuing to use it. So this is an addition. It doesn't really change the actual protocol at all. It just passes a little bit more information about the device to the authorization server to allow the authorization server to store this information, these 3 fields associated with the grant. The motivation is for revoking. So let me give you an example with the Roku. The device ID would be a unique ID of the Roku. The purpose to provide that is so that device can be represented as a single entity for revocation. So you could have multiple apps from the same authorization server. With one click, the user could revoke that entire device. The second is the model, just so hopefully this is available to the app. They can just kind of query, what am I running on? Like, oh, it's an Xbox 360, it's a Xbox One or whatever, which may actually have the same client ID depending on the implementation. And then the final is, and this would be extremely optional. They're all optional, but this would be the most optional. It's kind of like, does the device actually have a name? If so, pass that as well. So then you can imagine this revoke experience where it's, oh, William, you have a Chromecast and a Roku and another Roku or something, and it's like living room Roku, and you can kind of just revoke that and yeah.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. This problem doesn't seem unique to the device flow to me. It would equally apply to native apps running on mobile devices where you do have rich user input and you are potentially entering credentials right on the device. So this spec does not feel like the right place to solve this problem.
You're absolutely right that any native app has the same problem, and Justin has a spec from 2010 to sell you. Yeah, so he kind of had this idea all those years ago. I hadn't actually seen that until recently. We kind of came up with this to try and solve that revocation experience. There was another contribution on the list as well that was similar. I will point out that the device authorization endpoint is, strictly speaking, a different endpoint. So while we, for better or worse, reuse some parameter names across the 2 endpoints, and given this is in working group last call, just from about to be again, from a kind of process point of view, I think we could document this here if this was an acceptable pattern. And I mean, if we really wanted to, we could review these names and maybe not call it device. But I guess I don't disagree. I guess I'm just not sure exactly how do we solve it now for the device flow. And given we would actually need to document it separately, it doesn't matter, I guess.
I think if we end up with 2 different ways to do the same thing, that creates a lot of confusion for implementers. My other concern here is that if we are overly prescriptive about what pieces of information we're asking for device identification, we run the risk of ruling out use cases where potentially we need more than just these 3 pieces of information that we've identified here that work for the cases people are immediately familiar with. Okay,
2 points about that. So one is they are optional. So for example, I know there are some devices that may not have an ID, so don't send it. It's still useful from a UX perspective to know the name of the device. You can still perhaps do some useful things around that, particularly if it has a name that could be unique and the user can still differentiate, even if there's no even if you can't correlate the different grants in order to revoke the device at once. Yeah. On the other point, what was the other point?
William, I think this issue came up in Chicago already, in a question of what are we actually identifying in terms of client. And there, I had the impression that we also talked a little bit more about more extended functionality than just having some parameters that are obviously non-cryptographic. So one could argue that maybe you actually want to do some form of authentication, potentially attestation, that stuff you had been proposing in a different context, that would actually be appropriate here as well, because those are parameters. You use them for revocation, but you actually, as the title says, you may actually use them also for authorization.
Okay. I mean, that's not as
Yeah,
proposed
obviously,
here, but-
you can't use them here
Yeah.
now because they're just clear text.
Yeah.
You could, the device could just take them.
I guess actually to your other point too, that maybe these aren't enough parameters. My hope is that if there is a common minimum set that we think a lot of devices need, for interop reasons, let's document that common minimum set. I guess I'm not trying to capture every possible field ever, but I mean I do have a very specific use case and a reason for including these, potentially including these parameters. Like, I mean, honestly, I don't really mind if that doesn't get included. This is something that you can always document separately. You can say like, hey, if you're talking to Google, like, why don't you just add these, and then we can give you a better revocation experience. We have a use case for this. I think it's a reasonable use case. So I'm keen to hear any others. I haven't actually personally seen the attestation or anything like that in the wild, but I guess I'm not quite sure.
The attestation is obviously on the sort of more extreme end. In the middle, there would be some form, a cryptographic form of this, and this is sort of like on the other extreme. It's basically some parameters that the device can easily sort of free float.
Right. Okay. I guess I don't really have a strong comment on that proposal, but
I do, Descartes.
Okay.
So the device ID is problematic because you're just declaring it. There's no binding, tying. That's not an attestation, right? You're trying to say I'm a particular device, and anything could do that. The other two are useful from a UX and because the user is not going to know whether it's the right device ID thing easily or anything, right? So what you're trying to do is it in the authorization on the web app or whatever app the user is when they're deciding whether they want to enable this device, is you can be showing the model and the name as part of that to sort of complete the flow of, am I authorizing the device that's showing me a display here? And so the device would show, here's the model, here's the name, to help complete that, and so that later on when you want to revoke it, you know it's the right one. But also it helps you from knowing you're authorizing the right one.
Right.
Yeah, so the device ID suggestion is just as a correlable ID for revocation, just so you can. It's not meant to be cryptographic.
For who to use?
For the authorization service, they can present like they can just group the grants together. Do you see a security issue with potentially, like, do you see, if someone faked? I agree that it's fakeable. So is it bad if that gets like grouped together for
I'm trying to
revocation?
understand the value.
So the value is
the user's not going to really look at it.
So the value is, let's say the one authorization server has two apps, say like YouTube, Google Play Music, right? And so I have two devices, living room Chrome, Roku, and like bedroom Roku. And then rather than having like four things displayed for revocation, we could just have two, for example, right? It could just be, okay, you have the living room Roku and the bedroom Roku, and if you revoke one of them, it revokes both grants. So just knowing which are different clients, right? Which are different client IDs. So knowing, potentially.
Right, but each of those would have a separate device name from the user experience. Right.
May or may not. That could be both Wolves Roku.
If all of this is happening at the authorization server side, there's no reason for the device to be passing this information in. The authorization server could just assign a surrogate ID to each of those authorizations.
Yep, but in that example I gave, you would then have 4 discrete authorizations, 2 times 2. You wouldn't be able to group them.
I see what you're saying. Okay,
yeah,
that's fair.
Yeah, so that's why this one exists explicitly
this
to group the
enables you
4
to
into 2.
essentially remove all the things from a particular device, because assuming the device will provide the same ID all the time. Right?
Yeah, assuming that. If it doesn't, it's useless. So yeah, it's just to conceptualize all the grants and group them. So that's the purpose of one of ID, and then the other 2 are.
Regarding model and name, they do introduce a potential phishing risk if the authorization server is not validating those against a whitelist associated with the client ID. And if you're requiring the authorization server to do that, I'm not sure how much value it then having the client provide this information
But it
really,
would be
really
difficult
gives you.
to just use the client ID, because in this case you have one client ID, but then use it on many different devices. So you wouldn't necessarily know, or you would definitely not know the device name, or the authorization server wouldn't be able to infer the device name just from the client ID, because if you have the app running on thousands of millions of devices, maybe.
I'm more concerned about device model.
Okay.
Because if you're displaying that to the user and telling them, hey, you're registering a Roku 3, but the client ID that's being provided is for some other device, then you.
So, yeah, I guess two comments on that. The last one first. So you said, what is the value of the client providing this information? I would say one of the value is that, assuming legitimately provided information, is that at revocation, if I just see some random thing, it's like, what's that? I can't remember authorizing it. I'm going to revoke it, right? But if it says, hey, this is like your Roku, don't revoke, this is your Roku, I might think, oh, gee, I don't want to revoke that. So that's the value of the client providing it. It's an optional parameter, but if they provide it, they're at less risk of getting revoked. I'm not trying to endorse Roku, by the way. It's just
I'm more concerned about a malicious party using a phishing request to put up a prompt that's saying I'm authorizing my Roku 3 when I'm actually authorizing.
Yes.
But I think what you're pointing to is the fact that those parameters are essentially mintable and they are not cryptographic.
Okay, right. Two comments on that. Firstly, if we add this, let's make sure we do add that security consideration. That's a great point. A lot of the thinking I was doing around this was revocation, but you're talking about consent.
Yeah.
I think from a consent point of view, I agree. You might want to have a whitelist. So here's one possible implementation. This is not wouldn't be normative, but you could have, say, like a known list of 10. That way you're not just rendering random attacker provided text. But and let's say it's like Xbox. I think the advantage of that is, when I said before, is like one of the main questions we're asking, trying to prevent against phishing is this your device and is it in your possession right now? Being able to say, is this your Xbox? Now, if that was from a whitelist of 10, I don't particularly see how replacing this device with Xbox would be bad. I definitely see replacing this device with random hacker-provided text would be bad. So I think, I think you make a good point.
Is security considerations text is good. I'll go back to the kind of earlier points about implementers and clients not always reading the spec. So we should weigh the value of having that specified in the request versus derived on the authorization server side from a client ID, versus weigh the convenience of that versus the risk of people doing it wrong.
Right. Okay.
Maybe it is in the doc and I don't remember it, but there's a number of uses of this. It isn't necessarily clear to everybody. Some people view that the device, there's only one thing on the device, but the model is that there could actually be a bunch of other apps running on the device. And so the device knows who it is, but the app is trying to install and boot up, so it's, you're trying to enable Netflix on your Roku, which, as opposed to just enabling the device.
Right.
You may want to call that out because it may not be obvious to everybody.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that point.
Yeah.
It's definitely true.
And then sometimes people are just trying to revoke the service as opposed to across all devices, and sometimes they're trying to revoke the device.
Right.
And all the services on it.
Right. So I think without this, it would always be revoking the service across all your devices without the ID. Okay. So you planned it to go today. Yeah, well, this one was funny because actually, I guess I didn't include this in earlier drafts, but I actually documented this, as a proposal internally like a bunch of months ago. So I'm curious to see other people.
John Bradley from Ubico. So before Lucy gets up to throw this particular cold water, I'll beat her to it. That device ID is actually a correlatable identifier, and many device manufacturers go to great lengths to prevent different apps on the same device from knowing that they're on the same device. So there's going to have to be some significant amount of security considerations. I'm minded to and privacy consideration, I'm minded to separate this from the spec that's about to go into last call. This probably needs to be its own spec and consider how this relates both to mobile devices, limited display devices, and attestations, etc. I think this is its own fairly large ball of wax. I think that trying to stick this into the device spec at the last minute is going to cause the whole thing to blow up in IESG review with all sorts of she's already got a list of discusses that would completely tie us up. So I would say don't fall into that. Let's not fall into that hole. Let's get the device spec done and consider this as part of a separate add-on.
Brian Campbell.
Well, are you happy for John to speak for you, or I'd be interested to hear your points if you're having to? If you're happy to let John speak for you, then.
I think John summarized it fairly well. Okay. And if you're going through a full security audit again, I think you're at least a year out again on this document. If you want that, that's one way to go. I think you could drive a truck through this.
Okay. I guess in defense of these three parameters, they're not trying to be anything more than just self-client asserted, unencrypted, unvalidated, revocation hints.
I think it's good that you brought this up.
I could add underscore hint on all.
Yeah, because I think the context of this document sort of makes the whole topic more understandable rather than talking about it in abstract. That's why we hadn't had that discussion before. Right. So it was good that you raised it. But clearly, as you can see, we can all see we need a little bit more discussion on this, and then we need to make a decision on: is this a separate effort, or is this something in there, or are we actually doing something completely different? I don't know. Lucy.
Yeah, you mentioned several issues like multiple devices, renaming, revocation, all of which are extremely complex to manage. To add that at last call in this spec is not going to help.
Okay. Well, I think we shouldn't get hung up on the last call. So we thought that, like coming from the last IETF meeting, we thought that we are done. But often the last call is a way for people to look at it and actually raise things. So last call is not always the last call. So I think it's as good as any other time to raise these issues.
You see Justin.
Or Justin. Yeah, Justin.
I don't know what the order was.
Yeah, so a couple of things about that. One, actually, this loops back into Mike's question earlier of, why are people bringing up all these things now? And part of it is that this spec has sat kind of pseudo-stable and dormant for years. So people have actually been implementing this for a really long time in non-standard, but mostly kind of compatible ways. And so now that it's finally going through the standardization process, people are starting to pay attention to, oh wait, does this actually fit the use case that we've been deploying for 5 years? So that's where some of this stuff is shaking out. We are also really seeing a bend in the curve of adoption of sort of alternate modality devices, voice-first devices, IoT devices, and things like that, where this stuff kind of does make sense. And in addition, we do have some interesting use cases like the one I posted about on the list from one of my clients where this mode really does make sense, but it's only very recently that this kind of stuff has been coming up. So this is the right time for all of this to get hammered out, and I think that's why we're seeing that. All that said, everything I'm hearing is that this stuff belongs in a separate spec. I threw a link to just such a spec into the chat just now because, I don't know, I thought it was a good idea back in 2010. And in any event, I agree with the sentiment that that this really should kind of live in its own space, because what Annabelle said is also true. This applies to more than just the device flow. So we're not just talking about device ID. In my original spec, I called it instance identification because I was thinking more in terms of like, I think it was Dick was saying like public clients and a bunch of other things. This has applicability beyond other things. And as has been brought up, it's a big ball of wax. So I am with the thing, with the sentiment that it is too much to try to just slip this in here at the last minute, because we can do this in a standardized way across multiple flows that does address all of the security and privacy and other considerations as a separate document.
Justin, can you post the document that you mentioned to the mailing list rather than to some chat
I
window?
did actually. It's on the thread that's discussing this. Do it just from like, the last week or two.
For purposes of the minutes, what's the draft?
Draft Richer Oauth instance -00.
Thanks, Justin.
expires
Yeah, my
May
response to that
11.
would be, I'm inclined to agree. I guess I've been working on like the native apps stuff for a while, and we definitely saw the same problem there. So if you'd like any help, reviving that doc, I'd be very willing.
It's Brian from Ping. This may be moot at this point, but I had just one comment about the device ID that may be still useful. There seem to be a lot of concerns about the stability, verifiability, and privacy concerns of the device ID. When what I'm hearing is there's a very specific use case for using it to group authorized apps for the same authorization server system from the same device, which I understand, but maybe the same sort of things could be accomplished with just some sort of model or nickname hint, giving up the groupability use case. But if you think about like my Roku, I'm authorized with YouTube and Pandora and Netflix, and those are different services.
Right.
So there's no even physical way there's no way to group those anyway. I have to go to the different things.
Yep.
So maybe within a single service, having to give up that particular grouping is worthwhile in terms of avoiding some of the other issues.
You said maybe we could accomplish this with what?
He's just saying maybe the grouping is
I
not.
just want to hear what he said.
No, maybe
the
the
minutes.
the grouping functionality could be dropped in favor of just
A name hint? Yeah, what was the thing you were proposing?
basically just dropping device ID
Right.
from this. And I was using different names like hint just to maybe alleviate other fears, but really just taking the device ID and the grouping out of it might be a way to accomplish more or less the same usability functionality with one small loss, and maybe getting rid of a lot of the concerns around privacy.
Yeah, just one bit of feedback on that. The only thing is, I guess I sort of see that users mostly visualize their equipment as devices, not as like YouTube on my Roku and like play music on my Roku. I think the mental model is more like, hey, I'm like, I don't want my Roku anymore. Here it is, Brian. You take it, but I better go in and like delete my account from it. And I think that mental model does suit it. But yeah, I agree. You're saying it's a trade-off, and maybe it's just not worth the cost. So
just a thought.
yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe we should consider that with the. With
And we should also look a little bit at a time. We have
Yes,
two more presentations.
yes.
It was a great discussion. Don't want to restrict you in any way, but
All right, I can get through the rest in 30 seconds. So
So just to reiterate Brian's comment, because all you need is a locally scoped identifier. You don't need a globally scoped identifier. The global one is a problematic one.
absolutely, and I think the locally scoped one is preferred from a privacy point of view. I agree. So it's like a publisher device.
Right. It probably needs to be pairwise in the way that we're doing other things pairwise, and may relate to some of the stuff that we're doing around logout. So, or token revocation, etc., because it really is by whoever's doing the authorization. So the SID, or there may be other things that are more appropriate than a device ID, which is why pulling it back and looking at it
Yeah.
from a broader perspective.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm sensing a fair bit of consensus at least to look at that as an option in the future. Great. All right. Well, glad we had the discussion. Let me just wrap this up. There are no more new changes to propose. So just to go over a bit of running code, bit of an update. Google's AS is actually now 100% spec compliant with the 0.6 version. Hooray. There was like one difference since IETF 98. And I don't think we invalidated that today. So let's hope not. MITRE ID, I believe 1.3 should be released now since it was about to get released in Chicago. That's another, this one's an open source implementation. Of the server side, we have also an open source client implementation. The plan is to move this into the Oauth project, which once it's actually standardized. And Justin and I did some interop between the two. So yeah, there we go. And I think we've done the discussion.
Well, in all fairness, there's a couple of other open source implementations.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm not trying to exclude any. So I guess please.
We'll have to write them up and include in.
Great. Yeah. Well, and send them through the list because I'm not sure if I have that list. I would definitely include in the slides if I did. All right. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, William. Yeah, so we still have time.
All right, Oauth 2 token exchange. It's been out there for a while. In fact, I think it was the last time in Prague that I came and butted heads with Mike a little bit, trying to reverse the direction of this, and we came to some compromises to move forward, which were done shortly thereafter. And that was about 2 years ago. So yeah, here we are. That's a picture from last time we were in Prague. Next slide, please. So I try to give a little bit of context, even though it's been around for a long time, just for people that aren't totally familiar with it, a reminder. And this is a slide of one specific use case that's available with Token Exchange. Token Exchange is an extension to OAuth that allows for basically arbitrary exchange of tokens. Some client, doesn't matter who it is, has a token, needs to get a different token for some other context of use. And Token Exchange is just a framework to facilitate that. One particular use case that we hear a lot is a client in step 0 obtains a regular old OAuth token through whatever flow, device flow, authorization code flow, it doesn't matter. It gets one through a normal OAuth flow and it has it, and it sends it in step 1 to the resource server through a normal, RFC 6750 request with the bearer authorization here. And the resource server receives that, but it needs to get a new token with similar content suitable for a backend service that it has. So it does in steps 2 and 3, it does a token exchange here, sends that token up to the authorization server in exchange for a different token that is suitable to send to the backend server, and then passes that along just as an authorization token as well. This isn't the only use case, but it's one that's enabled by this protocol and is pretty common. So these two steps, really the spec encompasses send the token in, get a token back. Now there's some other concepts in there. You can send 2 tokens, which allow for you to express types of delegation and so forth. But at its heart, it's really just exchange a token or 2 for another token that can be used in a different context. The wire examples here are actually examples from the first part of the specification if you want to look in detail at it. But just trying to give a little bit of context, because the next slide doesn't have a lot of context, please. Just a status update. So draft 9 of this was published earlier in July with pretty small changes, which were addressing working group last call feedback. And I do highlight here that these were addressing what I feel like are actionable and meaningful working group last call feedback. There was one set of comments from someone that has made a lot of other comments on this and other specifications that are not necessarily meaningful or actionable, and I've addressed them to the best extent that I can, but I don't think that there's anything additional that can be done. I don't think he represents any sort of consensus opinion. And I further
Yeah,
believe
Rifat and myself will look carefully at his comments
you
and
would like
discuss
to
it with
review
him to see, because sometimes for some also for some newcomers, and he hasn't been active in the group directly, so it maybe sometimes be a language issue.
It's
like a terminology, language, etc. issue.
certainly possible. Just for what it's worth, he's been active in a number of other groups with
Sure.
Consistent behavior. But the things that we have changed based on that, changed one word from a non-normative can to may, just to try to clarify things. That was actually a result of his feedback. Added a statement clarifying that the validity of the subject token or actor token, the tokens you send in, their validity has no bearing on the validity of the token that's been returned outside of the context of the exchange. So they have to be valid when you exchange them, but there's no correlation implied thereafter. So once you have a new token, it's decoupled from the original token. That's always been the intent in the case, but there was some wording out of what last call feedback that asked to clarify that. We did change one error code from a may use in a certain context around requested resources being inappropriate or unable to fulfill. I had a may in there, which it should have been a should, I think. In retrospect, I think it was just a careless wording at the time, so we tightened it up a little bit. Clarified text, it's the same normative stuff about using non-identity claims within the ACT claim and them being meaningless, so that you shouldn't use them there. And added a little bit of privacy considerations. Actually, I stole some wording from WS Trust to sort of be all-encompassing about the privacy considerations of this use, because it's very difficult to cover them all, but I wanted to address some feedback that those were missing and provide a little bit of guidance, or at least awareness of the privacy considerations involved. So those are the changes that have been made. They're all relatively minor, as I said. So yeah, next steps. Next steps here is I'm pending your review of the other feedback and discussions with people. I would ask that we transition this to waiting for write-up and or moving forward. And this is a photograph of a busker in Prague that I'm not exactly sure what I meant by it, but it feels a little bit like the state of this draft, sort of like waiting in boredom, but with some sort of impending danger of this giant snake around his neck at the same time. But it was Prague related. I like photos, and so you can interpret that how you will.
Good. Are there any immediate comments on this document, or are you guys good? We had a working group last call, as we decided at the last IETF meeting, and the plan was to wrap this up and ship it.
Okay. All right. That went a lot better than
you
Williams. No,
good.
than Williams. I expected it, but you never know.
Yeah. Only this minor changes. Only editorial changes. So.
All right. The other presentation I have today has a very similar title, and I get confused typing in URLs and end up with the wrong one all the time. But this is Oauth 2 token binding. We have another photograph from Prague the last time we were here, because that's what I want to do. So try to set a little context here without getting too deep into it. This draft is intended to provide an Oauth 2 proof of possession mechanism. We talked a lot about the value of proof of possession on Monday, I believe it was, in terms of what that can bring you in terms of preventing issues with lost or stolen access tokens. So this is one mechanism to provide that proof of possession and defeat, play or replay, inadvertent play by the wrong party of lost or stolen tokens in the OAuth context. And that includes access tokens, refresh tokens, and authorization codes. Next, please. So current status here, jumping out of the context into the weeds. The token binding working group documents, there's 3 of them: TLS negotiation, the protocol itself, the message format, and how it all applies to HTTP, are all very, very close to being submitted to the ISG for publication. My understanding is that they're waiting for the working group chair go-ahead and or the Shepherd write-up. If any of you know the chairs of that working group, I can't quite recall who they are, Perhaps you could encourage them to continue that work. I believe there are also recently some NIT fixes on the drafts, which are very minor but important in. Anyway, they are in a relatively good state and very, very close. So that's good. In this draft, the OAuth token binding, draft 4 of that was published also early in July. Apparently I did it on the same day. There's some very minor editorial fixes. More clearly define how to convey the token binding information of an access token in an OAuth 2 token introspection response. This itself is very similar to the work that was done in the MTLS bit around OAuth, around token introspection, all catalyzed from a comment that Justin made at the last IETF meeting, which was that there was a lot of assumptions being made about how this would work with introspection that were not clearly stated in the document. So this just calls them out very explicitly. And as a part of all this, there is now an introspection request, introspection response parameter request registration to IANA being made in the OAuth MTLS specification, which sort of broadly encompasses all of this and is applicable here because we're using the confirmation method as well. My expectation is that that document will progress more quickly than this document, so I put the registration request there and then removed an open issue related to that. And again, just clarified exactly how that would work. And I also added a long rambling open issue about the need to allow for a web server-based client to opt out of having refresh tokens bound while still allowing for access tokens themselves to be bound. I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So getting into open issues in the document, I'm defying the conventional wisdom here about having a lot of text on a slide, mostly because I wasn't sure how to narrow all this stuff down to a slide, and it's meant more for me to, as a reminder of what to talk about. You get a picture of that, William? Excellent. So one of the open questions that's been there from the beginning is what should we do in the case that a refresh request for a token-bound access token is received, but the refresh token itself was not token-bound? It's a fair question. It leads into the next question, which I won't read the whole thing, but it's about web server clients. So token binding at its core is developed for use cases where there are many different clients, web browsers, native applications on phones. And it's a nice way to sort of dynamically create additional trust and bind tokens from those individual devices. When it's brought into the OAuth fold, there are different kinds of clients, and one of those clients is potentially a web server. Facebook from its web servers acting as a client calling services at Amazon. And token binding of a refresh token in that context is a significant issue because those web server clients are likely distributed across many different nodes, very likely geographically distributed across different data centers, maybe even different cloud providers hosting them. And shared access to a private key is oftentimes cumbersome or impossible in such environments. And this is all before we get to the question of what token binding client-side APIs are going to look like. And my expectation is that what is already a very cumbersome, sometimes impossible problem will not be made any easier by the APIs that are provided around token binding, because they're really meant to be, they're not ephemeral keys, but they're sort of on-demand generated client-side keys that adapting those APIs to be able to also securely store private keys and share them with the entire set of your clustered applications is, it's not going to happen. I think there will be a small subset of implementations that could figure out how to do it. They will be in the vast minority, and I think if we don't address this problem, it will severely hinder the adoption of token binding in this context. And the real value of token binding in this context is to bind the access tokens to prevent them from being misused or replayed in other contexts. Where when we have the refresh token, it is already bound to the client credentials established with the web server client. Oftentimes, yes, that is a client secret, but those are long long client secret strings, and we also have stronger forms of client authentication that can accomplish similar benefits like mutual TLS. So I'm strongly advocating the need for some kind of solution here. I see two possible approaches, and one is to toggle the behavior based on some kind of client metadata. So client registration metadata isn't required, but it's often used, and even when it's not used, it strongly suggests a model for client registration data, even with providers that do static registration, and we could put some stronger text around that. But a way for individual clients at registration, those that have client credentials established, private clients, to say, please do not bind refresh tokens for me, even though I would like access tokens bound. And then the way that access tokens are bound are by presenting the token binding information at runtime, which includes the provided and referred token binding. I think that's probably the most straightforward solution. It's easily implementable, easily understood. The metadata parameters already largely exist, so I think it would be just some wording around their usage and some normative language about, right now they're just sort of suggestive and indicative, and they could be enhanced a little bit to say, in this case where this indication is false, the authorization server should not token bind refresh tokens. Getting back to the binding the refresh tokens to just sort of further complicate, one of the main problems is the only way to request token bound access token is through the presentation of the SEC token binding header after negotiating token binding and including a referred token binding in that. And in order to do that, by definition of the spec, you also have to provide a provided token binding. So there's no way to make that request without providing the data that's right now in the standard said to be used for binding both refresh and access tokens. And yeah, I'm sorry, that was a bit of a divergence, but I sort of missed saying that before. The other potential solution here, yes, question.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. I'd just like to say that I think that the metadata approach is very reasonable, and I really don't want to think about what are the security and threat implications of providing a runtime way to disable a security feature.
I think that's a fair and reasonable criticism of the option that I had not yet presented. So
oh, you alluded to it.
I guess I did sort of allude to it, but way to look into the future. We did discuss this a little bit yesterday to try to clarify our own thinking about it. The other option would be to allow for some sort of parameter on the token endpoint request for the client to express the token binding ID that it would like the access tokens to be bound to. It could do that without negotiating token binding, without providing the provided token binding, which would then mean that the authorization server would have no way to bind the refresh token, but it would have data sufficient to bind the access tokens. I was kind of liking this approach for a while. I think there may be other simplifications of client-side APIs that it allows for. I actually think the security implications are okay in this context. But having said all that, I think that the metadata solution is more straightforward, easier to implement, and addresses the immediate problem, and doesn't open up any potential security issues that I'm not aware of, even though I think it's okay, and continues to use consistent behavior around how token binding is conveyed and verified and so forth at the token binding for HTTP layer. So. At this stage, I'm inclined to request that the next revision of the document include addressing actually both of these issues based on client metadata, because the client metadata can also take care of the understanding or at least clarifying what to do in cases where access token and refresh token don't have the same binding information.
John Bradley, Yubico. I vote for option 1. I think option 2 has a couple of decomposable points. Runtime switching is going to cause problems. There may be other reasons to have token binding negotiated on that TLS connection. I think there is a separate issue lurking in there, whether or not we need a separate parameter for being able to express the referred token binding separate from the referred token binding in the token binding header. But I think that's kind of a separate issue. So I think dealing with it in metadata, saying it's okay with sufficiently strong client authentication, because in principle you want to authenticate the client if it's a server. We could direct people to use sign jot or other stronger mechanisms, so they're not using HTTP basic and passing that on the line. So I think we can give good advice about using mutual TLS, sign jots, etc., in combination with token binding for the access tokens. I think we still need to have a discussion point on whether or not in these clustered environments it's actually reasonable that the token binding API that's provided can get the referred token binding from another node, or should we be saying, yes, the node that's going to use the access token has to be the node that's getting the refresh token. So there's more discussion that needs to happen on that particular.
I agree with it, but it is separable from here. So I think leaning towards metadata.
William Dennis, I don't know if you explicitly called this out, so I just wanted to ask, is this only for confidential clients?
I don't think I explicitly called it out, but yes.
Okay.
So
okay.
Thanks for the clarification.
Great. Yeah, because I guess like a native app, for example, doesn't have it's not only is it not confidential, but it's also shouldn't be distributed. So
that's right.
It probably falls in the category of, hey, you really should token bind your refresh tokens.
Yes.
And secondly, I guess like ideally we want everyone to be using token binding for OAuth eventually. So
ideally.
Yeah, I guess the only risk I would see is like, if we allow too many people to opt out of too many things, then they may just like, oh, it's too hard to implement it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to encourage, people to still bind their access tokens, even if they click the opt-out box for the refresh token.
I hadn't thought about it so much in that context, more the other side of it, that I felt like not providing this opt-out would de facto mean that people won't be able to implement it. So, but I think there may be some guidance or wording around this that helps address or alleviate those issues.
Like, for example, could you see a world where refresh token binding, like potentially, where refresh token binding is optional, but access token binding could be compulsory, like for a particular authorization server? And I'm saying like in 5 years, but like,
yeah,
is that a possible outcome from this design?
Yeah, I think so.
John Bradley again. So we do have the mutual TLS option, and in some cases, mutual TLS for access tokens might better fit somebody's deployment use case. So I wouldn't say maybe mandatory proof of possession access tokens. There may be more than one mechanism for doing that.
But he did say in the context of a particular authorization server might very well.
Well, but even a particular authorization server might,
but you could, yeah.
So we don't want to be overly prescriptive, but I mean, the concern I think at the moment is the only way for somebody to turn off being broken because they have a cluster and by default the refresh tokens are being token bound would be to disable token binding on their calls to the token endpoint, which mean that they can't do access tokens, token bound access tokens. So this at least allows somebody to have that, to be able to do token bound access tokens without token binding the refresh token.
Correct.
So this is a first step, not necessarily the whole road.
Agreed.
William Dennis, just to clarify, I wasn't saying that we should be prescriptive in that sense, but just that a particular authorization server itself could say, for us, access token binding is mandatory. Still, even with this sort of relaxation, even if they implement this metadata relaxation.
I think so. All right, great. Next one. It's a little better. Couple more open issues. One is a question of whether the scope of this document should include some kind of standardization or at least guidance on using token binding with JOT client authentication and or authorization from 7523, which is the JOT client authentication and authorization draft. In some ways, I feel like this is easily inferred from the existence of the confirmation claim, how it's used and would be used in this, in this context. In other ways, it might be useful to just say something about it here, because I think it is, particularly for client authentication, it's maybe a really nice, useful security enhancement mechanism. But right now, it's not in there, and it's sort of left up to the imagination or an exercise to the reader.
John, yes, we should write it down because it's only self-evident to us using the confirmation claim in a self-signed JOT for client authentication. If from the look on Hannes's face, yes, it is actually just self-evident to us.
You're right. The scope of people to whom it's self-evident is probably relatively small. As a co-author of the document,
what
I'd
specifically
welcome
do you want to give us a short summary of what you would like to write down?
Since John's in favor of it, I'd love for him to write it down. But since I know that won't happen, it would be probably a small subsection of the document that describes how one would use the confirmation claim with the TBH token binding hash confirmation method inside of it in the context of the JOT client authentication. Not real controversial.
Yeah, looking forward to see it.
Okay, yeah. And then this is all sort of related, but the metadata needs some work. The main problem, I think, is that there's a reference to the Oauth 2 protected resource metadata, which is not an ongoing draft. So we've got a kind of a hanging dead reference. I think it needs to be removed, and some clarity about what can and cannot actually be inferred at runtime from the metadata values and what can be enforced should be added there. This has been sort of an ongoing reminder to myself that it exists, as well as a hope that Mike that wrote the original text would go back and fix it. Although we chatted a little bit about this yesterday, and in the context of a similar problem with the OpenID Connect layer token binding spec that has similar issues. And I believe I have some ideas basically about a roadmap about how to keep the same intent, remove the hanging reference, and clarify the text in a meaningful way. So I think we're good on that. And certainly anything that's written will be another draft and available for review. So it's on my list to do. Like I said, these were just listing the open issues.
So be a little bit more precise. What do you want to do there? Like you want to remove that reference and
that reference in that particular metadata field are going to go away, and there will be the text around what's currently there of detecting attacks, what to do in cases where bound tokens are expected but not received, will be just reworded to clarify what is and isn't possible, and perhaps provide some guidance on what to do. All right, next slide, please. So just looking ahead, hopefully the core underlying token binding documents progress to RFC here pretty soon. I know Andre is looking forward to that, even though he's not listening right now. Work through these open issues. I think I have a way forward for a lot of them, so that's good. We definitely need implementation experience and feedback here. There's growing implementation experience in token binding in general, but most of the client-side implementation is currently in the browser. So we haven't seen like client-side widely available libraries yet. Server side's also questionable, but coming along. So this is still early. I think there's a lot of room to learn and work from there, but it's progress. And then get the band back together again at IETF 100 in Singapore. And here's a John Belushi impersonator, just to help you get the band back together or get in the mood for it. That's all I've got.
Dick Hart, Amazon. In the current token binding, with access tokens, we're not really dealing with a TLS proxy around how do we push that proof of possession all the way through to the application and preserving that integrity. Is that viewed out of scope for this document, or is that in scope?
I would view that as out of scope for this document. because it prescribes how it's done with OAuth. There is a document that was just accepted as a working group item in the token binding working group that describes how to convey the information from the TLS terminating layer as a reverse proxy, convey the token binding information that was verified to any applications in the backend, which would allow them to do what's implied by the OAuth layer.
Which is trusting the TLS layer around what
Yes.
it's doing.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
So that doesn't provide the same security characteristics of other proof of possession mechanisms that go from client directly to the application.
That's correct.
So is there not interest in doing, I mean, I consider it an OAuth problem because it's a proof of possession type token. We're trying to go and add proof of possession into OAuth to flow, which is, a protocol that works at the application layer as to how do we get that signal uncompromised and securely all the way to the application layer. So you're saying that you don't consider that to be in scope for OAuth? The token binding is really how do I move the
It's in
bound.
scope for OAuth, but it's not in scope for this document.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's in scope. It's not in scope for this document, and the technical solutions right now rely on some kind of established trust between the TLS terminator and the application, and that's the work that's going on.
Well, you could argue, Brian, that, for example, the document that Justin has been working on with the HTTP signing is such an application layer approach. Whether it's the right one or not is a separate story, but
Yeah, that's true. So this is a TLS layer binding approach, and
with all the pros and cons.
with with everything that comes in with that.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think Microsoft had something internally that they were using around how did they move that, continue the signal all the way through to the application.
Mm-hmm. Did you? Do you want to speak about it?
We do, but I don't know the mechanism well enough to speak about it at this time.
Okay.
And just from a technical perspective, I don't know of a way to do it that is tightly bound, because it's bound to the TLS connection between the client and that TLS termination. So everything that happens behind that is simply moving signals, but not something tighter than that. And if there's a practical way,
the verification's happening at the application layer.
That's correct.
And so if the TLS proxy doesn't know currently the token's opaque. I mean, not opaque, it's visible. And so I think the Microsoft solution was they were encrypting the token so that then the proxy wasn't able to go and see what was the EKM in the token.
Very
well, I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to go off of what
there are.
Okay, so nobody's one. You guys consider it out of scope for this spec, and two, nobody has a clear idea about how to solve it yet.
I would say that's true, but to be fair, I'm not sure you clearly articulated the problem. So, yes, I mean, you're talking.
The problem is that the TLS terminator is in a different trust domain than the application.
Okay, we
trust the thing to terminate TLS, but we don't necessarily trust it for managing the tokens.
Okay, then I don't. That's certainly not in scope for this document. I don't think there's a viable technical solution using token binding. I could be wrong. But
so for anybody running in AWS, right, they're having to trust the terminator if they're sitting behind it.
Yeah, which they do now.
Lots of our deployments don't.
But they give it their private key.
What's that?
But they provide it with their private key, right?
Well, they trust the TLS terminator to manage TLS, but they don't trust the terminator to manage the token or manage authentication and authorization.
So
in AWS, API calls are done with SIG-V4, which gives you end-to-end proof of possession.
Okay.
Right. Which transit fine through TLS proxy. And so, you know, ideally, we would like to use something that was more standard, but it doesn't have the token binding and access token. What you're proposing doesn't solve our problem and give us similar security characteristics around what we already have with SIG-V4.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that. I would encourage you to look at what's being done in the token binding group.
I'm saying it's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to provide that.
On the other side of it, I'm hopeful that systems like Amazon's application layer load balancing will deploy what's being proposed in token binding right now, so you can enable your customers' applications to do token binding both of cookies and OAuth access tokens and other things like that. Okay. I think we're talking about different problems now, or at least in a different context.
So, John Bradley, Ubico. So, I did attempt to extract the information from the devil the other day about what Microsoft is doing for Office 365 native apps. And there is some notion that there is an additional token binding ID, which is added to the token binding header, which is generated by the native app that is signing over some piece of material which is negotiated from the thing behind the proxy to the app itself. And I asked the devil to have his minions provide us with said information, but it is potentially it's not something that would work with browsers as deployed.
Mm-hmm.
It may be something that's secretly in Microsoft's libraries. I don't know, since you're looking at me like I'm crazy, which is probably because the devil is full of lies. So there is potentially something there. I don't understand it enough to be able to write it down or adequately explain it. So perhaps if more information can be provided to this working group and the token binding working group, we can understand why Mike wants additional token binding IDs passed through and all of the other sort of intertwined issues.
Sure.
Sounds like an OAuth issue to me, but hey.
So some kind of sign-in or application layer piece would provide it. It's not token binding. And just to reiterate, like we can't write standards based on unknown individual deployments. We have to build them on other standards. So that's the context I'm working in here.
So Andrei Popov, Microsoft trying to speak of the devil or on behalf. So I'm not entirely familiar with what was just said, right? So like I know what the implementation of token binding looks like in Windows because I worked on that. It's just an implementation of the standard where we build messages, where we allow the caller to specify what type of binding they want to do. So basically that's what we have. You know, on top of that, how a specific system uses that, I don't really know. You know, can't comment on that. I would be surprised if there was a solution that provided the end-to-end token binding validation of the type that was just discussed, because that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If you're terminating TLS at the TLS terminator, that's where end-to-end ends. You see what I mean? The terminator, if you don't trust your TLS terminator, you know, it can inject requests, it can, you know, do all sorts of bad things. You know, you can have an architecture where the backend server actually verifies the token binding by having the TLS terminator pass the EKM and the, you know, token binding message to the backend, but it's still not really, you know, end-to-end to the application, because again, you're still trusting that your TLS terminator is passing the correct information to you.
Yep.
So I'm not aware of what that solution
Actually, we discussed this in the context of the proof of possession work in OAuth, and we had this write-up which we need to update the architecture document that talks about these different ends and these different nuances, and which is why we had, for example, this HTTP signing solution specifically to deal exactly with the fact that things terminate in different places, and so you have different ends in that communication. as you all know, we ran into some issues with the HTTP signing, but and people had entertained other ideas, and maybe there are different layers on what some of the deployments want to provide in terms of security guarantees. But I think it's definitely in scope of our work. We just have to come up with ideas on how to best solve it, and that had been a problem in the past. We didn't make sort of rock solid decisions and then move that forward. Does that make sense? No, I didn't. But there are documents out there that at least say something. But yeah.
I'm not gonna. I thought I had something intelligent to contribute, but I don't think I do.
Well, it's Friday, you know. Okay.
Now would be as good a time as any.
No. Sorry, this is Dirk from Google. I guess, Dick, then it sounds like you already have a proof of possession thing going with your particular authentication protocol that you're using. Yeah. So you're good, right? What's the question?
Dick Hart, Amazon. We have what I would consider a proprietary mechanism that we call SIGV4, which is how API calls in AWS are made. And so that works, but it's non-standard. So I would prefer moving to a more standard model that worked across the internet, as opposed to us having a model that works really well for us, but doesn't work as we
Could you elaborate a little bit on how your solution looks like? Because I'm not familiar with it.
So SIGV, there's a secret, and you sign a request, and then that you sign the request, you sign everything, and then that's verified at the application layer.
So are you essentially saying, is it an HTTP-based signing mechanism, or is it like a JSON-based protecting some sort of constructing a request token, if you will?
It's more HTTP-based. I'm essentially signing the whole request.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's
that
which is then a proof of possession mechanism.
Sure.
Right. And
does that relate somehow to what Justin had written up?
I don't know.
Okay.
Okay.
I believe it was.
Yeah. But it prevents compromised TLS proxy from changing your request.
So I looked at the when I was writing the initial HTTP signing thing, I did look at the AWS solution and a few others. There's I believe it's Kavich or Karavich, I forget his last name. There's another specification out there. And one of the issues with a lot of those is that they presume that the HTTP message itself doesn't get transformed. And that was a problem that I personally ran into a lot of with Oauth 1 implementations, with parameters getting reordered and added and stuff like that. So that's why my version differs. That's really the main difference between the one that I had proposed and these other ones, which say effectively, take the HTTP message, as presented, and do your signature on that on both ends. And my understanding with the AWS side is that there's just a lot tighter control over where you get access to at the application layer, the HTTP bits. And so yeah, I'm definitely, I was aware of that. It is related in the sense that they are solving a lot of the same problems in similar ways, but there are some different considerations in play.
But I hear that we sort of have an action item for Dick to look at the current actually HTTP signing working group document, which I believe it's expired. That's why you couldn't find it on the page, data tracker page. So I think that would be a useful step and figure out whether that actually solves the issue that you're having. How does that sound?
Right, and if people wanted to have a you know, a mode of that one that just signs the pristine HTTP request. That should be easily doable too. So yeah.
So that doesn't build on token binding.
What was that? The audio.
I think it layers. So Dick said that it doesn't lay on top of token binding.
Oh, it could. Yeah, it could layer.
could.
They're orthogonal. You could apply. You could have a token-bound proof of possession access token where you're signing the HTTP request at the app layer, and you're also doing token. You're binding the token to the TLS channel. You could do both.
Well, that wasn't really what I was looking for. The feature that I like about binding is that you're not having to do client management of a key, right? So that's one of the downsides of SIGB4 is that you're having to go and manage a secret over with the client. And so token binding enables you to get many of the characteristics of proof of possession without actually having to do key management in the client about how do you get the key to a client. So I like that characteristic of token binding, but then wanted all the security features we still had in proof of possession all the way through to the application.
Gotcha.
Otherwise, it'll just use what we've got. It works.
Okay. I wonder, like, what would be a reasonable next step on that issue? Is it's not totally obvious to me, but maybe you could still have a look at the document and see, but because you want token binding, you don't want to have it at the public up to the application layer. You want to have it standardized. You don't want to have to manage keys in the client.
So you still have to manage keys in the client. You don't have to distribute keys to the client. Which is a little
distribute,
which I understand is the hard part. Distribute's
Yeah.
the hard part. It sounds like you're asking for a HTTP level signature with the token binding key.
No, it can't be. With the token binding key. Yeah, maybe.
That sounds conceptually like what you're looking for, which is
not. That's not. Is that possible?
It depends.
Well, I don't know whether it's possible, but I mean, we like the idea of token binding, right? And we like the idea around not having to do management around distribution of keys. We have a mechanism that works now that gives us a lot of very powerful characteristics that enabled our customers not to be worried when there was compromises on the TLS stack. So we're reluctant to not continue to have that. And so I'm just phrasing that, we're interested in a solution like that. I don't necessarily know exactly how it would be solved. So I was trying to figure out whether it was in scope for this particular document, because this has many of the right characteristics. It just doesn't deal with TLS proxies, which is most of all of our deployments have a TLS proxy.
So, yeah. So the answer is it's not currently in scope.
Okay.
There's work around TLS proxies that is in scope, but does not address
the OAuth.
Does not address your specific concern, which is not unique to OAuth.
Which is fine. But I think the issue needs to be around OAuth, because we are talking about doing the application layer.
Yeah, it's an API access mechanism, and OAuth is primarily.
But the issue to describe is also applicable to
other environments.
To normal use cases, to token-bound cookies. That if you trust in the TLS terminator in that context is exactly the same thing.
But I think
in a cookie world, there's no other mechanism, right? That the TLS is passing the cookie, and that is your existing trust model. Where in an API access, what's that?
Yeah,
right.
But token binding's giving tools to address that in a standardized mechanism, and those are being worked on. So
for cookies, sure,
and for
but you don't.
The same issues exist with cookies. Like there's not a magic.
I'm saying in cookies, there was no binding of the whole request in the cookie from the browser all the way down, right? So you're not losing anything in moving to token binding.
That's also true in OAuth. So you're referencing your proprietary
right.
solution and wondering why the standard doesn't address and saying that we're losing
Well, I'm not wondering why. I'm saying
You're
I'd like it to be able to move up to that level of security characteristics of what we have.
Okay. I hear the request. I don't think it's applicable here, but
But we need still, we can still discuss it on
We
this.
can-
I think
we
it
can
sounds
discuss
like
it, yes.
something. Having said that, you may have noticed that I disconnected my laptop, meaning that I believe we're actually done overtime already. So thanks for showing up. Mike took good meeting minutes, so we'll distribute them. And yeah, thank you all for showing up and contributing to the work. Thanks, Mike. Thanks a lot. Oh, the blue sheet. Where's the blue sheet?
Yes.